Well, good morning, everybody. For me, this is an unusual experience. I haven't been in a lecture theatre for 2 years. Various reasons that stopped me on my tracks and forced me to call on the help of the NHS to reconfigure my body. And that's given me time to reflect. So it's actually quite a challenge to look back on 25 years. In fact, you're right, it's 30 years since Roger Mansfield had the courage to hire me to take me on as a research professor here, and had the second courage to back my crazy idea of setting up a lean research center. And that was Roger Mansfield taking a punt. And we'll ask him tonight whether he still thinks that was a good idea, but it was a seed. And I've been planting seeds all my life, and that's, I think, what I do. So that's what I thought I would do today, is reflect on my lean journey, because everybody has a journey and has a lean journey. Lean is a process of continual challenge and rediscovery. And just when you think you've understood something, you go and look in practice, and actually that doesn't quite work like that, and you go back and talk to the Toyota guys, and they say, now you're asking that question. Think about it this way. And they ask you another question, forces you to think about it, and you realize, actually, it's absolutely 90 degrees from what you initially thought. So constantly, we're learning, and I'm still learning. So I thought I'd share my journey, reflect on your journey as we go through this story and compare them, because everybody's journey is different. My generation, we're largely shaped by the experiences of the Second World War, not of our experience of the Second World War, but our parents' experience. My father flew Spitfires and was in prison camp in Germany for 4 years and was part of the march at the end of the war to North Germany that nearly killed most of those prisoners. And my mother's Dutch and survived the occupation in Holland, and particularly in Amsterdam, where she was a music student, and she watched most of her fellow music students, who a lot of them were Jewish, being taken off to the concentration camps. So many of my generation have read all the books, the flying books, the stories, the war books, and so on, and we're profoundly convinced that we needed to find a better way to prevent that happening again, and to prevent our children having to experience that. And so that was very powerful in focusing us on the real questions at that time that we wanted to address. And the two ways in which we answered those questions about this mustn't happen again, was the creation of the institutions, the World Bank and the GATT open trading system that actually has been the foundation of enormous growth of living standards right up to our present time. It's being challenged and dismantled partly by Trump and others, but basically that has provided the foundation for billions of people to come out of poverty. And the second challenge was for nations that had industrial systems that have been either used to a protected environment, colonial empire market, to actually learn to compete in an open market, and for the Europeans to recover. The challenge for my generation was, well, how do we recover and improve productivity quickly to catch up with the living standards that we know can be obtained and were demonstrated in the United States? And providing the context for that was the reason for studying European industrial policy and the formation of the larger market in Europe, and also for creating the conditions where we could build European champions as well. So those were the questions. We were looking at studying industrial productivity. That's where I did my apprenticeship, studying economies of scale, plant size, productivity in Britain, Germany, in the United States. And in doing that was drawn into a big project, global project, that MIT was starting called the Future of the Automobile Project, which was a project to study the future of the car and the car system and the car production system. And just as the Japanese were rising. And the second phase of that project, the International Motor Vehicle Program that led to the machine book, was the opportunity for us to create the biggest global benchmarking project, to actually begin to describe in detail a fundamentally better way of making things and delivering things and so on. So IMVP revealed a new level of performance for the rest of the world to learn to catch up. And so that became the question, of course, how can a system that delivers vastly better quality, vastly less effort and costs, and much faster time to market in a traditional sector, through eliminating waste, how do we learn to spread that knowledge through the rest of the world? And that really became our mission. And Jim and I decided that we were not going to go through the consulting route. There were plenty of others who did. But we were going to start off as missionaries and gradually try and document this business system, the elements of this business system, and teach it across the world. And to date, there are, I think, 30 different members of the Lean Global Network, independent non-profit institutes around the world that are teaching and translating and experimenting and doing research, spreading Lean across the world. So that's the purpose for getting into this. To understand what was wrong with our existing business model and what this alternative business model was, because that, I think, is what it is. So in the Western business model, it was absolutely full of waste, most of which we can't see. But as we begin to use lean techniques, we can begin to reveal. Taylor began to apply sort of pseudoscience, I have to say. Taylor wasn't actually very scientific, but he used the word, to study work, basically who worked faster, and force everybody else to do the same. And that became the basis for industrial engineering, good solid stuff at application of science to the understanding of work. But he also separated thinking and doing. And the thinking about the job was actually done by thinkers, and the doing of the job was done by drones. And their drones were controlled by the classic command and control production system. And of course, you had tremendous waste in terms of quality that was not picked up immediately, that is delivered to the customer, et cetera, et cetera. We'll come back to that. More important was the application of science to the disciplines of all of the management functions that Sloan gradually evolved in the General Motors example, and in others, Sears, Roebuck, Ford, and so on, built the functionally based organization to deploy scientific knowledge across the business vertically, which is absolutely the right way of applying knowledge, gradually deepening knowledge and applying it on a consistent basis through the organization. But in an organization in which command and control basically was full of politics and intransparency, management's only ability to also deploy resources was to deploy resources as well as knowledge vertically through functions. And this is the basis of the MBA model, training model, was basically training those functions. So we deploy resources vertically, which of course means we focus on optimization of assets and on utilization of assets and point optimization. And that is the best we could do. If everybody's busy doing something that probably at some point adds value, may not today, but maybe later, that's the best we can do. And that was the management system that we encounter and that we lived with that created a tremendous amount of wealth in the 20s and 30s and 50s and 60s. Also part of that was the separation at a strategic level between the decisions, the strategic decisions on the one hand, and the execution of those decisions on the other, which was left to internal experts or external experts and consultants to be hired and do best practice and implement best practice and roll it out across the organization. We've all been there. We've seen the Six Sigma programs and so on. So that created an organization in which there was a tremendous amount of waste. Waste in terms of quality, waste in terms of lots of queues, lots of buffers, lots of delay, lots of amplification, all of the things that we've discovered as we gradually dug down and to understand how do we improve the flow of work. Lean, in retrospect, I think Lean provides us with not only the tools but also the mindsets necessary for humans to make systems work. You cannot design systems purely to be totally autonomous. And we'll come back to that later. Systems in which you've removed all the buffers and you want to create a continuous flow can only work if each of the elements is done right first time on time to perfect quality. So the big starting point with Lean is actually enabling people to learn to do the work consistently, but also improve it on and on. So big foundation of Lean is making any systems work. A system is only the multiplication of the probabilities of each of the elements working correctly. I remember Bosch came to Cardiff, put a huge, great automated line in for direct diesel fuel injection systems. And because even though each item, the utilization and the uptime was very good, it wasn't good enough because there was always somewhere down the line, a break, some interruption. So they had to separate the line into at least 3 pieces. That's a classic example. So how work is done, Toyota calls build-in quality, but it's also about doing work right first time. That's the foundation, and then you can start thinking about focusing on the horizontal flow of work that had been ignored in the traditional business system. It was actually invisible in the business system. And so we had great fun doing lots of value stream mapping and beginning to introduce concepts of single-piece flow and pull and Jidoka and leveling and all of those other tools and techniques. And at the same time, making plan versus actual visible. So you could actually see those problems and respond to them quickly. So those were the 3 sets of insights that we gained that I think collectively are essential for enabling people to work to make a system work. So I think that's essentially what we were doing. And it's not just the tools, it's the thinking that comes through using the tools that's actually critical. And that led us to lots and lots of training programs and the Lean tools. Lots and lots of redesign efforts. My goodness, we have drawn so many maps for people. They were great maps. The conclusions were right, but they ended up being put on the shelf because the mindset change didn't go with the maps, and they hadn't done it themselves. And we saw a lot of professionalization of Lean teams and Lean programs. And we will discuss what happened to those in a minute. And we had a good time. Look, we spread these ideas far and wide. Far wider than I ever expected. I learned a tremendous amount at Unipart about how to build knowledge into the shop floor. And that's what the Unipart U was all about. We learned a tremendous amount, collectively, a lot of us, through working with Tesco and applying these ideas to warehousing and distribution and logistics. And taking those ideas, I took those ideas to the European efficient consumer response movement, and we had really a powerful impact on European retailing through that. And that continued on through the work Simon and others did for the IGD on the upstream food supply chain, and that still informs the work of IGD today. So we planted a lot of seeds in the distribution, the logistics and retailing world that's still alive today. In manufacturing, very early on, as the Japanese came and taught us a lot, tremendous amount. I spent a lot of time up in Sunderland and later on in Burnaston and less in Swindon. It became clear that there was going to be a real need to improve the supply base. So we did those Anderson benchmarking studies early on that led to the DTI and the SMMT. We sat down and we designed that industry forum program. It's actually my idea to get the three companies together to loan their engineers to train a cadre of people in second and third tier suppliers who could then spread the word in the first tier supply base. And I think that's one of the building that industrial strategy that contained industry forum, went on into the Foresight 2020 exercise and so on, was just part of the manufacturing spread. I mean, Cardiff did an awful lot in a lot of manufacturing companies introduce lean. Later on, I got involved in the Rethinking Construction program where we introduced those ideas into the construction industry, and it's taken a long time, but those ideas really have begun to take root in the construction industry. And that's very gratifying, although it's taken a very, very long time. And after I left Cardiff, I organized the first global lean healthcare summit for all of the early lean pioneers in healthcare, which again has now led to as you say, a very large movement spread across the world, applying lean thinking in healthcare. It's going to be a long slog, and healthcare people have to do it themselves and have to internalize it into their own language and their own experience. But it's beginning to happen now. Virginia Mason, IHI, a lot of others. And we're seeing really good examples 10, 15 years after the initial pioneers. But we had a lot of fun, we did a lot of influencing, we created a lot of activity, and we did some good, there's no question about it. But an awful lot of it didn't stick. And the question is, well, why didn't it stick? Well, there's conflict between this lean way of thinking and the traditional business model. Finance guys could never see the benefits of all the Kaizen works. And where is it in the numbers? We didn't have a lean accounting system, so traditional accounting doesn't recognize the improvements because most of the variation we're attacking is hidden in overheads anyhow. So we got pushback from finance directors. And we also got pushback from systems, from the alternative, the techies. I remember being invited to by a big global pharma company to a big conference in Florida for the whole corporation. There's 500-600 people, massive, great conference where the IT department was announcing that they were going to, from now onwards, decide how the business was run. They were going to completely transform the business with IT systems. Why I was there, I have no idea, but maybe to add credibility to that message. And, well, you know what happens to those big IT systems. It was a sobering thought. I've had a lot of experience of dealing with big corporations. And one I remember very clearly was being called to a headquarters of a big consumer goods multinational with 250 plants around the world. A new CEO said, I have a big problem. And we said, oh yes, we can improve the efficiency of manufacturing. He said, no. My big problem is I have the biggest SAP system in the world with 9,000 people in 3 sites around the world running it. And where's the benefit? And it takes me 2 years to make a change to this system, by which time the manager who requested the change has actually moved on somewhere else. This is the biggest rigidification of my business, and it's the biggest headache I have. Very interesting. That same company also taught us a big lesson about functions and about the lean function in particular, the improvement function. We proposed to start with a bunch of pilot plants around the world that then would become the hub for the next generation of plants. And we'd cascade the lean experiences throughout. And they said, no. We first have to spend a year creating a toolbox and a rollout program and so on, you know, the classic Six Sigma stuff. And we ended up in an enormous fight, which taught me that, and in fact our proposals never made it to the CEO because we were blocked by the improvement function, who wanted to own the change and roll it out as a professional staff rollout. You know what happens to those? They come and they go. And that's exactly what happened. So to me, headquarters looks like a bunch of barons, very bright barons, fighting wars with PowerPoint to secure budgets for their bosses, for their knights. And it's in a crystal castle, and actually most of their effort is wasted. I also joked with a company in, maybe not mention the company, a big global logistics company, who I said, you know, what would happen if you got rid of this building, this headquarters building? They said, actually we know. Because last July, it's not last July, but several years ago, last July we had a major malfunction. And of course, you know, in Scandinavia, everybody's on holiday in July. There's almost nobody at headquarters. The company solved the problem without headquarters being there. So we know, actually, it's not necessary. Talk about waste. Vast amounts of waste. And the sad thing, of course, is that I've seen so many lean, really well-intentioned lean efforts degenerate into firefighting and PowerPoint, chasing and cost-cutting. Don't tell me you haven't seen that too. That's only... Now, the response to that, of course, is to say, well, why? The other response is to say, well, those tools don't work. Let's find some other tools that do. And I've heard some people argue that, and argue that we were too purist and so on. But actually the challenge, of course, is to rethink, well, what is it in the traditional business model that is actually causing these things to die out and to fade and to degenerate back into traditional behavior? And it may be that first of all, we started thinking, well, what we need is a management system to support the use of these tools. But actually it's not, it's more fundamental than that. Because actually Toyota is focusing, whenever you go there, whenever you talk to them, they're focusing not on optimization of traditional activities, but on dynamic growth through learning. And so it's actually leadership and learning that needs to accompany the use of the tools and techniques and the focus on the horizontal value stream and so on. And we do that through developing Gemba experience through PDCA and A3. And I say experience because it's not just using the scientific method to solve a problem, it's using a scientific approach to think about the experience of trying to solve that problem. And to learn from the experience of solving that specific problem at that specific time in that specific organization. So it's actually bringing scientific experiments, scientific logic to the experience, to the reflection of experience. So you're accumulating your experience of what works and what doesn't. And not just personally, you're doing it in a team. So you're getting cross-functional sharing of experiences. Small teams. So that's really the purpose of the spreading of the problem-solving discipline. It's actually providing a scientific basis for the reflection on experience. And line management, not staff management, not lean teams, line management's responsibility is actually building the capability of the team to solve tomorrow's problem through solving today's problem. The sensei is never interested in your specific result from your A3. He's totally uninterested. What he's interested in is what was the thought process that you went through in addressing that problem, and what did you learn about it? What is the takeaway? What will you do differently next time? So it's that cumulative capability, and Toyota judges the capability of a manager when they move on to another area by the ability of the team to continue to do their work and to improve their own work. And we focus those efforts using Hoshin, but we immediately look at the tool and the catchball and the matrix and all of those whizzy aspects of the tool without actually stopping and saying, well, why are we using this tool? We're using this tool to make the now transparent performance of the value streams, so there's a design value stream, the delivery value stream, the production value stream, to make that visible to everybody, so that therefore the resources who carry, the functions who carry the resources can see where they can help by adding resources and tackling problems and redesigning elements of the system to improve it. So it's actually solving that conundrum between the needs of the horizontal and the resources that are deployed vertically. And the chief engineer, which I'll talk about again in a moment, is the person who actually marries that and distills it. So Hoshin is about managing the resource conflict between the horizontal and the vertical in a very dynamic way. And it's also about alignment, and it's also about triggering, sending challenges down the organization and assessing proposals up from the organization about what to do to solve those challenges, those gaps that are identified. So it's a very interesting, different take on on the true importance of Hoshin. And more recently, in studying leaders who've been very successful with Lean, there have not been a lot, but there are a good handful now, a growing handful, people who've had really good experience of leading Lean themselves, often having been part of a Lean program before, but then get the chance as a CEO to do it right themselves. And studying their behavior brings to bear a very key insight, and that is they need a coach. Not a coach, they need a sensei. It's not a mentor, it's not a coach, it's a sensei who will take them to look at the detail, to see the way the system is preventing the detail from carrying out its work, and then will show them the implications of that, solving that problem for the total business. See the strategic implications of the detail and begin to see that as a way of focusing not only their own learning, but also then building up a system that can actually support learning down the organization. So it's really, really interesting. A sensei is a term we invented in the West to try and describe the practice that Toyota guys, real Toyota experts, do instinctively. And it's worth pondering on. So, in conclusion on this learning system, TPS and A3 are learning frames. They're frames for helping us to learn to undo the traditional thinking and to learn the thinking that's appropriate to running an integrated system. And behind that is also, more significantly, a very different way of thinking about decision-making. Instead of traditional decision-making, which starts at the top, defines this is what I want, there's a bunch of experts define the plan, and then we'll give that plan to others to execute, and they will roll it out, classic, as I described in the Six Sigma rollout program, and then we'll deal with the consequences, when the plan actually bears no relationship to the reality, and reality kicks in. And that's a classic top-down management. Lean is about going to the front line, seeing the struggles at the front line, understanding those, recognizing that they exist all across the organization and often are there because of the way management is behaving, not because the front line is doing anything wrong. And then saying, okay, let's face those problems and let's measure them across the organization, measuring it to focus people's attention on it. And let's then use those to frame the experiments that we will use to test the hypotheses about which solutions would work in this particular context. And then from those multiple experiments, we will form solutions that we will implement. It's a very different decision-making system. And I think, and I don't claim this Michael Ballet came up with this, me prompting him in the background. I think this is as significant as the difference between fast and slow thinking, which I think is also extremely important. There's a lot of literature now distilling the experience of those leaders who were successful at leading lean for at least a period of time. And we've written our own book on Lean Sensei and on lean strategy. So that we are beginning to understand what that takes. But again, great leaders understand learning. It still is running up against the traditional business model at a strategic level. So we talked about the tools and process level, we talked about the leadership and learning level, now we have to talk about the strategy and purpose level. Traditional business model is all about maximizing shareholder profits. We've seen a lot of discussion now how that is distorting things. It has generated a huge amount of wealth for the shareholders and for managers that have been complicit in share buybacks and all that kind of thing, but has actually impoverished the rest of the world. And there's a lot of discussion right now about the fact that we need to move away from a shareholder-only focus for business strategy. Quite right. Traditional strategy was based upon controlling markets and controlling customers. Tremendous amount of marketing effort goes in that. How much of that is waste? Huge amount. And it's about controlling markets and customers, and deploying all the tools and tricks of the trade, including the internet now, to sell what we need, what we make. It's all about, as I say, execution through bigger systems and bigger digital systems and so on. And when people like Stiglitz say, I can see huge amounts of evidence of the computer revolution, I just can't see the results in any of the data. He's right, you can't see the results in the data. It hasn't saved much money. That example from unnamed company with the big SAP system is exactly a case in point. We've added a tremendous amount of cost, and we can do new things that we couldn't do as a result of that, but it hasn't saved any money. Our view, particularly in America, of business is we replace people by low-cost labor or automation if we can. Let's just get rid of them. And that leads to one of the curses that has led to inequality and populism. In my view, it's very, very clear. One was financial deregulation that led to the banking crash and the fact that none of the bankers suffered in the banking crash. The business model that absolutely destroys any commitment and engagement with work. Engagement levels are going down, discontent with work is going down, feeling of unfairness and the inequality is going down. And the third, of course, is the political response of austerity, which actually squeezed the resources for the poorest people in society. They're rebelling, absolutely right. So this business model is actually part of our systemic problem that we have to find alternatives to. Now, there are, again, we can go back to Toyota. I don't believe Toyota always is right, always gets everything right. There are times when Toyota stumbled badly, but they recovered again. And they have still a lot to teach us. If you've looked at Toyota's sustainability strategy and minimize its footprint strategy, its goals and its system for analyzing its sustainability of its products, its factories, its operations and so on, is by far the most comprehensive I've ever seen. And it has been the thing that has designed them to actually define the technical choices that they're going to choose to follow rather than what would make money. The whole hybrid story, I remember being in Bosch with the executive team just about to kick off the Bosch production system when the hybrid prototypes that they got from Japan just arrived, and they were keen to tell me this is just a folly, this is stupid, this will never work. And 6 months later, they had the biggest hybrid research team in Europe. So sustainability has driven the hybrid, electric, hydrogen evolution that is actually defining the industry. And there are a lot of other players who followed their example and are going to give them a run for their money. But still, that as a strategy of defining what the market really needs, not what customers are today willing to pay for, is key. Second example is this role of the chief engineers in being the person who doesn't command a lot of the resources. In fact, he depends on the function heads for all of the resources. But his job in a person is to crystallize the experience from the user's Gemba, from the technical possibilities in the different functions in the organization, and from the production Gemba, and decide what needs to change for this next iteration to head towards the right goals. And he embodies that and is there to learn from the next generation and so on. So a very, very powerful way of embodying the vision of the next generation product and developing a product development process that actually can more rapidly iterate through generations, which is exactly what we need right now, and I'll come back to that. And the third, if you've looked at Toyota, not only Toyota's design architecture, but they've been doing some fascinating work on very simple, non-powered, flexible automation and modularization. And they have come up with a totally revolutionary, vastly simpler, totally flexible automation system, which they're experimenting with in China and in Japan. So 3 very fundamentally different examples of a very different strategy that is based upon technology being seen as enhancing human decision-making rather than replacing humans. Toyota was never greatly enamored by autonomous cars. We're going to have driverless cars, which the Americans are hooked on. And in some circumstances, that's going to be right and that's going to work. But in many circumstances, that's not going to work. And if you look at the whole history of autonomy, there's some very interesting literature which demonstrate that in most cases, we still need a human impact, a human input into managing systems, complex systems. So it's very interesting, a very different approach to technology. So I conclude from that we need a very different approach to work and how we organize work. We need a very different approach to learning and developing capabilities, and we need a very different approach to how we think about user needs and define the strategy based upon user needs. So it is actually a business model. You can't actually do this without acting at all 3 levels in the long term. And this is taking a while, but the discussions now on the strategy level, on the future of capitalism and so on, are really beginning and are going to go much further than I think we experience. So I think it's a new business model, and I think it does 3 things. One is it builds a socially acceptable and socially responsible work environment for people, provides meaningful work, and automates the meaningless work. Absolutely, I'm absolutely in favor of that. When I go to call centers or back office processing of banks, and I just, however nice it is, it's meaningless work. So socially responsible, providing meaningful work and opportunities to develop the capabilities of people to manage processes, systems, customers, and so on. The second is our experience is that Toyota's approach to product development, incremental product development, isn't so significant in the startup phase, but is extremely important in the scale-up phase. It's in the scale-up of taking a crazy idea that's unaffordable at this point in time and iterating very quickly and getting feedback from customers and users very quickly that actually is key to developing new technologies that we're going to need in the future. I think the digital revolution for me isn't about the big platforms. They're utilities, they need regulation. There's a whole privacy discussion which is going to be big. But it's actually what we do in the second phase of the digital revolution is what we do using those platforms. Using coding, code-free apps, code-free opportunities to automate most of the support activities. And Dave has been doing some absolutely pioneering work on that because it is possible now to automate away most of the support activities as we're discovering. And it's part of a bottom-up, distributed set of new opportunities that we can do that will deliver real benefit on the top of those big platforms that are there as a result of the very traditional business model. So faster scale up of new technologies, I think. And the third is, clearly, we are going to have to change a lot of things very quickly if we're going to survive. It's as simple as that. And so to be environmentally responsible, we're going to need to engage people, and we're going to need to use and exploit as many of the technical opportunities as we can that are opening up and turn those into usable solutions to our climate change problems. So I think this is the real reason why these ideas will have legs and will go on growing and evolving and be renamed. That's fine, I don't care about that. Fine, call it what you like, but actually don't lose sight of the origins, because whenever you lose sight of the origins, it just starts floating as nebulous collection of ideas that have no structure and no origins and no reference point. So don't do that. So I'm proud we planted some seeds. Here, we planted a seed here, I've planted lots of other seeds, and those seeds have grown. You're here, and we're still here. Sometimes we get discouraged. A lot of times these ideas don't work because gradually we're having to encounter the thinking, the old thinking that we grew up with, and learn our new way to act in a very different way. So let me just close with a few challenges for educators. The academic world, after 25 years, is now finally catching up with Lean. There are now over 4,000 papers, I'm told, written on Lean. My question was, well, what's the quality of those papers? And there's a big question. I've seen so much bad research. You know, tick these boxes. Have you got 6 boxes? Are you using these tools? Therefore, are you doing Lean or are you doing not Lean? Beware. Think about the relationship between those 3 levels of the organization, the strategy level, the learning and leadership level, and the work level. If you're only simply addressing a few little pieces of those, in what context, and has the context changed, and how does the context influence, and what is the causality? I mean, that most business research, I think, suffers terribly from the fact that we're dealing with very complex multi-causal systems. And yet we're trying to use very crude causality research. So most of the spurious research, most of those academic papers will be ignored. I know that you have to write them, but actually they're going to be, it's Muda. I'm sorry. On the other hand, well-selected academic work with a really solid empirical foundation that is matched is not just illustrating knowledge, but is illustrating the lessons from experience, those can have a really profound effect. So I'm not dismissing all academic papers by any means. And I expect them to be there to be a lot more, but be careful of the spurious research, which is just there because academics have to do this. And I think universities are going to face a massive challenge, not only from the online education thing, but actually there's still, the MBA program is still classic. That's how you would think about educating people for Alfred Sloan's or Jack Welch's modern management corporations. Experts no longer determine everything. Experts serve to support the people who create the value. That's a fundamentally different thing. And that's about experience and knowledge and linking them together. So we have to think very carefully about how education, how we learn not only this knowledge, but how we learn how to distill and learn from our experience. And that can only be done yourself. You can't be taught it. And it can only be done through encountering and challenged by real problems and working together in teams. And I've always thought that the only way of capturing that knowledge that I can think of is a portfolio of A3s. Like a pilot's flight log, I know exactly where the pilot's flown and what experience he's got and all the rest of it. Somebody who's experienced at reading A3s can actually see very clearly the thought process the person went through, the level of understanding they've reached, and the kind of problems they've tackled. So that actually, if you brought me a portfolio of A3, I can tell an awful lot about the person. I mean, I have to be skilled at reading A3s, but actually, once you can really see the capabilities you're dealing with. And surely it's the capabilities we need to hire, not just ticking boxes or sitting in classrooms. Most of the knowledge is gained out in the field. So those are the words of wisdom for educators. I honestly think that we planted seeds here. These seeds have grown and in different directions, and that's absolutely great, and that's fine. I don't want to own any of it. But I do think we need to see the big picture, stand back and reflect as I've done, and see the context in which we're working. And see that it is going to take time. And the more experiments, the more we can reflect on those experiments, which is often what we don't have the time to do, and we write down the reflections about what works and what doesn't, the more we will gradually build up experience that we can share. And that is actually what a sensei does. A sensei actually is about teaching a structured way of learning and experiencing experience, if you like, to leaders, but it can happen at any level, leaders at any level in the business. So we're building future leaders, and we're building an environment, hopefully, in which the strategic business model also becomes a lot more socially and environmentally responsible, and in which we can leverage the technologies that we will need to survive. So that's my lean journey. It ain't ended. I hope yours goes on a lot longer than mine does. So best of luck. Well, I mean, Toyota's never made anybody redundant. And there have been a few isolated cases where they have had to close plants, like in Australia. But actually, Toyota makes a commitment to its employees that it will employ them for life. Because Toyota's been so successful, they've been able to fulfill that commitment. So I think there are circumstances, absolutely, in which we are not going to be able to keep people in the same kinds of jobs, and they will need to move, and we will need a big socially responsible effort to help them find other jobs rather than just leave them to fend for themselves. So this is going to be messy. It's not going to be easy, and there's still going to be an awful lot of people who think, if only you could get rid of people and automate, that would be great, because we can make more money. So that's, lean is not going to replace the existing business model. It's going to gradually demonstrate that it's a better way of working, and people will go and work there. So, it's not black and white, but I do think that an organization that actually engages the people doing the routine work in improvement. One of the very best examples I've ever seen was at Unipart. Had a proud culture of engaging people in quality circles. And they had annual management meetings, big management. Everybody got up and talked about their results and all the rest of it. And they used to have one slot which was for a team that had done something outstanding. And this was a team from one of their warehouses that I knew they'd actually had to give them reading and writing training beforehand because they were so uneducated. Came up, stood on the stand, and gave a fantastic tale about how they had addressed the problem, talked to their customers, solved the problem, and so on and so forth. It stole the show. So, it's not a question about smart people and stupid people. It's people developing a pride in doing the work that they do. You see these restaurant programs where unskilled people learn how to develop a real pride in being able to work in a disciplined environment and cook brilliant dishes. You can teach anybody. So, that's the right spirit. Will everybody adopt that? No, it can't. Of course not. But I don't believe, and yes, there will be some big changes in terms of what work we need doing and what work we're going to pay for in the future. But I'm not a doomster. I don't think people are going to be automated out of existence. It could happen that way, and if it does happen that way, populism will carry on. And we'll see just the same as the Trump and the Boris effect. Sorry, I'm getting political. But this looks to me very much like the 30s. And that worries me. And I think the business model is partly responsible. We are partly responsible for that.